Okay, welcome back, everyone. If I can possibly invite you to multitask rather than bolt down the last of your baguettes and sandwiches, feel free to eat and think if you're able to, as I say, do those several things at once. But just so that we don't waste the time available to us this lunchtime, I'd like to make a start. And to do so by introducing our keynote speaker. It is an enormous pleasure to introduce our honorary professor and indeed a very old friend of the Centre of CSTPV, Lord Jonathan Evans, as our speaker. I hope you'll forgive my saying, and I hope I've remembered it not too inaccurately. Lord Evans once told me that when he joined the British Security Service, MI5, back in 1980, the entire process was, shall we say, rather British and indirect. So much so that it took him a few weeks to actually realise quite what he had joined, let alone what he was meant to be doing. Clearly that role must have become clearer over time, because in April 2007 they made him Director General, in which role he stayed till 2013. I might note in passing, significantly, a notably successful period, I think, in British counterterrorism. He's speaking to us this lunchtime on the title, A New Manifestation of Political Violence. No question mark, but interesting choice of political violence rather than terrorism. I sometimes use the analogy from the Blues Brothers in explaining why our centre is called the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. If you remember the scene where the Blues Brothers, desperate to reunite the band, desperate to give them a sense of purpose and focus, turn up in some redneck bar that they pretend they have a gig for and surreptitiously get a word with the barmaid who assures them beamingly that, yes, sir, we have both types of music here. We have country and Western. Well, you know, we have both types. We do terrorism and political violence. But as I'm sure we will hear, I think perhaps the choice of terminology here may be significant. If you could join me in giving Lord Evans a very warm welcome, I'd be grateful.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have enjoyed an association with St Andrews for a number of years. When I was the Director General of MI5, I gave instructions to private office that although my diary was busy, that if I got invited to St Andrews, they would say yes. So I've been it's been a very sort of enjoyable and worthwhile relationship as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to talk about something completely different from the main thrust of a terrorism conference, and it is an area relating to political violence. But I'm going to start with a little bit of kind of reminiscence, because when you get to my age, that's probably a good idea. I've taken a professional but not an academic interest in terrorism and political violence for over 30 years. I started with Irish terrorism in the 1980s and progressed to Islamist terrorism in the late 1990s, when I do recall and in the early 2000s, when I recall a very articulate and pushy guy from the Rand Corporation called Bruce Hoffman, who used to turn up in my office and explain things to me in a very illuminating way. En route, I had some passing involvement in extreme right-wing terrorism in the 1990s, when one or two neo-Nazi fragments in the UK flirted with the idea of launching a terrorist campaign against what they called ZOG, the Zionist-occupied government. They were inspired by contacts with far-right extremists in Europe. And later on, I also had some involvement in the case of the lone attacker David Copeland, who mounted a very lethal campaign against gay and ethnic minority targets in London. I also had a brief exposure to the activities of the animal rights extremists who tiptoed around the edges of terrorism periodically in the 1990s and 2000s, going so far as to mount an undercar booby trap bombing and a bomb attack on Bristol University. 10 years later, the campaign of intimidation directed against product testing company Huntingdon Life Sciences, both directly and against professional services companies that assisted it, caused considerable concern to government, though it was never categorised as a national security issue, and the public response to it was coordinated by the police rather than the security service. The level of government interest in terrorism has waned and waxed over the years. Irish terrorism was a major, sometimes dominant public policy issue in the UK for decades. Palestinian terrorism never attracted so much interest, although it was a background concern for 20 years or so. Extreme right wing has generally been a specialist subject, seen less as national security threat than a law and order problem. And this, in my review, results from the fact that the far right, certainly in the UK, has never so far managed to sustain a significant long-term campaign of attacks, nor has it really developed any ideological base that comes anywhere close to posing a political challenge to the democratic mainstream, even at a local or community level. It probably helps that most of those attracted to far-right ideology are not the most collaborative and well-adjusted individuals, and as a result of which they do tend to fall out with each other rather spectacularly on a regular basis, and they have a tendency towards self-aggrandizement, and they don't have the organisation or personal skills to cope with life's little setbacks. It's only in the last few years that any extreme right-wing group with terrorist aspirations has been categorised as a national security threat in the UK, though that's now the case for National Action, a new neo-Nazi group that espouses violence. I think it's debatable whether the distinction that is drawn quite regularly in the UK between national security and law enforcement is always particularly helpful. It's evident that all terrorist acts are crimes as well as national security events, but the law enforcement national security divide has been useful for several reasons within government. First, national security agencies have traditionally focused on understanding the overall nature, scope, and direction of national security threat actors, what you might call a holistic rather than an incident-based approach. Second, national security agencies attract certain protections in the courts that are not available to law enforcement agencies as a matter of course, and they also operate with a less transparent accountability regime, although I ought to say, in the presence of Lord Campbell, a very effective accountability regime, since he used to sit on the parliamentary accountability body that I reported to. And these advantages sometimes give national security agencies somewhat of an advantage in counterterrorism. Third, national security agencies have a narrower focus than law enforcement, particularly on intelligence-led threat disruption, which means that their resources are less thinly spread and they can develop specialist skills and capabilities to help them to succeed. And finally, national security agencies have historically had a closer relationship with the government policy community, which has been useful to government when addressing threats with political dimensions such as terrorism. For example, certainly in the UK system, the national security agencies are geared up to provide intelligence reporting to government in a way that the law enforcement agencies are less likely to provide. Nevertheless, I'm not sure today that these reasons are as compelling as they may have been a generation ago for drawing a clear distinction. Law enforcement agencies have invested very significantly in intelligence and analytical capability in recent years and have narrowed the gap with the intelligence community, with whom they now work very closely and on an integrated basis. Legal privileges for national security still exist, though my guess is that when the increasing overlap between intelligence and law enforcement operations continues to mature, these might come under increasing pressure from the courts, which would be a difficult situation to reach. And finally, on the question of the relationship with government, the independence of operational decision-making remains important, both to the security service and to the police, but law enforcement understanding of government and of policy pressures is considerably more sophisticated than was the case a generation ago. I note with interest that recent developments in the still delicate security situation in Northern Ireland have led to a blurring of the lines between national security and crime concerns, for instance in respect of loyalist and dissident Republican groups whose activities sit on the boundary between gangsterism and political violence. In terms of political attention, Islamist extremism has taken up most of the bandwidth because it posed an actual threat to the safety of the public for approaching 20 years. And that has ramifications, and it has ramifications in terms of foreign policy, implications for social policy goals such as community cohesion, and it touches on hot-button political issues like immigration. Its political and media potency is very clearly demonstrated by the most recent attack in London in November 2019, where 2 people were stabbed to death by an Islamist extremist on London Bridge. That's a terrible crime. But on an average month in London, 5 or 6 people are stabbed to death. Now, I realise that to a US audience, that sounds a pretty feeble total. But we don't have the advantage of the Second Amendment to help, so that we have to rely on rather inefficient means of killing each other rather than doing it more effectively. Nevertheless, though the death toll was roughly what you'd expect in London on a bad week, the attack had major political and media impact, with general election campaigning paused, the Prime Minister, leader of the opposition and Mayor of London all attending a vigil later in the week, and full-scale media coverage for days. So terrorism works as a publicity device, but largely because the media and politicians inadvertently collude in it. In my view, we underestimate the potential resilience of our societies and make too much play of terrorist incidents as they occur. Against this picture of a diverse and politically charged terrorist picture in the UK, I'd like to discuss one manifestation of political violence that I think is underestimated and has much less political charge than it perhaps deserves, and that is the intimidation of figures in public life, not in general by what might be called terrorist organisations, but by pressure groups, social media users, and single-issue fixators. I happen to be the chair of a curious body called the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which notionally advises the British Prime Minister on public ethical standards. In 2017, the committee, under my predecessor, Lord Bew, published a report on intimidation in public life, which had been commissioned by the British government. And it's from that report that I would like to draw in order to illustrate the problem that I think it is worth considering as a manifestation of political violence that is underreported and does not attract the academic scrutiny that, in my view, it deserves. Over the last 10 years, the level of abuse and intimidation of public figures in the UK has risen very sharply. Abuse and intimidation are, of course, different things, though they are often related to each other. Some of what we have seen in British public life has been clear intimidatory behaviour, such as threats to kill candidates for elected office, threats to kill their families, including young children, daubing of candidates' homes or cars or those of their families and friends, sending false allegations to neighbours, and a very large number of rape threats directed at female public figures. Jess Phillips MP, a well-known female Labour MP from Birmingham, who has a young family, reports having received up to 600 online rape threats in the course of a single day. By any standard, that is intimidatory behaviour. Meanwhile, abuse has also risen very sharply. It's estimated that in the most recent general election campaign in the UK, there was a 400% rise in online abuse directed at candidates, with a particular focus on women and on members of ethnic minorities. 1 in 6 tweets to candidates was categorised as abusive, and whilst abuse is not violence, abuse on this scale is likely to be intimidatory, especially when seen against the background of, for instance, the murder by a right-wing extremist of female Labour MP Jo Cox during the 2017 election, and a more recent conviction of 2 members of National Action for plotting to kill another female MP from Lancashire. So I believe that the large-scale abuse and intimidation are connected phenomena. From the point of view of the victim, one can easily change into the other, and the threat of violence lurks behind both of them. Abuse and intimidation in the UK are not directed solely at political figures. Others in public life are also suffering similar problems. Some parliamentary officials have suffered sustained abuse for undertaking their duties in ways that some have found inconvenient, and I'm not referring to the news from the UK this morning if anyone's interested. Officials involved in the Brexit negotiations have been on the receiving end of intimidation and intense abuse, and so on. This is a widespread issue, and in case anyone is thinking I'm arguing in my own case, I'm not. I haven't been subject to it, so I am arguing on behalf of others. I fully accept that this is a very different sort of issue from that normally considered by academic conferences on terrorism and political violence. And any response would involve completely different players than those involved traditionally in counterterrorism. But I do believe that this does matter, and it matters for several reasons. First, if our democratic representatives are to reflect our society, we need more women and members of ethnic minority communities to stand for office. And though it's difficult to prove a negative, there is strong anecdotal evidence that some politicians, most but not all female, have chosen not to stand again for office because they found the abuse and intimidation that they and their families were experiencing to be intolerable, and other potential candidates declined to stand for fear of what they would experience. This is unacceptable and undermines the free public debate that underpins a representative democracy. Secondly, there is strong anecdotal evidence of elected representatives changing their voting intentions on controversial subjects for fear of the consequences for themselves or, more often, for their families, lest they vote in a way that attracts the hostile attention of some fanatics. I have personally spoken to MPs who have considered changing their vote in this way, and who in turn had talked to others who had already done so. Other well-placed commentators and observers have reported similarly. This is a very serious matter. Subverting the free democratic process by threatening violence against elected representatives is a matter of national security, in my view. If a hostile state were achieving this, it would be treated with the utmost seriousness as a national security threat. So what's caused this problem now? The question arises as to why this problem has become so much more acute recently. The evidence taken by my committee suggested that intimidation and abuse had become much more widespread between 2015 and 2017 elections. And although some senior journalists believe that the problem had first been clearly evident in the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. It's easy to assume that this is really about Brexit, which has been a highly divisive issue in the UK. But although some Brexit extremists have undoubtedly been active in both abusing and seeking to intimidate their opponents and perceived enemies, the problem is wider than that. I've already referred to the Scottish independence referendum, where the so-called cybernats were very active, but both moderate Labour MPs and Liberal Democrats have been on the receiving end of abuse and intimidation from far-left elements, and momentum is often mentioned in this regard. Angela Eagle, a gay, politically moderate Labour MP, was found to have been subjected to a campaign of intimidation that appears to have been motivated both by extreme left and homophobic views at the same time. Nor is this solely a UK issue. In Italy, 89-year-old Holocaust survivor Liliana Segre received hundreds of anti-Semitic messages and was subsequently placed under police guard after she called for the Italian Parliament to establish a committee to combat hate. In the US, there are similar concerns. Roddy Reed, professor at the University of California, San Diego, has said, quote, "Since the kickoff in 2015 of the last presidential campaign, a climate of fear and intimidation has dominated public life in the United States to a degree rarely seen before." I was struck by the reference to 2015, which coincides fairly closely with some of the evidence of the UK experience. It seems likely that part of the reason for the upswing in abuse and intimidation now is that social media has afforded easier opportunities to intimidate and abuse. In the old days, in order to abuse or harass a public figure, you had to get out the paper and envelopes, find your green pen, and then send the message via the post. The feedback loop was more or less missing and anonymity uncertain. Social media remedies those shortcomings and makes the whole process much easier and more emotionally gratifying, since others can pile in and reinforce your views. There's also been much discussion about the violent language used by some politicians. One bravely anonymous but rather overwrought Conservative minister involved in planning a political coup against Prime Minister Theresa May told journalists, "The moment is coming when the knife gets heated, stuck in her front and twisted, she'll be dead soon." Actually, they flunked it, but that's beside the point. The question is whether such language used by prominent politicians has stoked up intimidatory behaviour, or at least been taken by some as giving permission to say and do things that might otherwise have gone unsaid or undone, i.e. that it has been a disinhibitor. There may be other deeper social and political reasons why this has become a problem now. Maybe the current polarised politics evident in the UK, but probably much longer embedded in the US, is a factor. But we do not know for certain because few people appear to be doing much research in this area. There's been some journalistic interest and some incidental data gathering to support specific stories, but it's neither thorough nor rigorous. There's some research out there from the academic community that even I, not by any stretch of the imagination a research professional, have found, though that appears to be related to single-issue harassment and intimidation in the US particularly, and I couldn't find much on the wider impact of this issue on public life and public discourse, and relatively little relating to advanced Western democracies other than the US. So my conclusion is that we have seen over the last several years the emergence and growth of a form of political violence, actual or threatened, in some Western countries that is having a significant impact on participation in public and political life, that may also be having a direct impact on some democratic political decisions, that is associated with extremism but is not driven by specific extremist groups, but which has not attracted the attention of the academic community to the extent that it deserves, but needs that attention because it is currently poorly understood and hence difficult to counter. I hope that in a few years' time we will find that conferences like this are able to discuss insightful, useful research in this area that illuminates the problem and helps those concerned with the health of our political system to design responses that benefit us all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, for those very provocative remarks. I have myself been struck, at least in the UK context, I can't speak for the US, but in the UK context, how separate the debates on the overall health of democracy and the potential role of violence and threats of violence are. They don't seem to be integrated. I would entirely agree with that, and I think they absolutely need to be. There is a long CSTPV tradition, really goes back to Paul Wilkinson's work, which predates CSTPV, back to the 1970s, of looking at how democracy should react to a range of violent threats, and that's something that we try and keep alive and kicking. I'm sort of cursing myself for not having recruited you for the module I'm about to teach at a guest session, but you'll be glad perhaps to be let off the hook. For now, though, we have nearly half an hour, so I'm just going to throw it open to the floor, and if we can sort of work on the same formula we have already this morning of collecting a couple of questions, hopefully the masses hungry for knowledge will come thick and fast with questions. So who wants to be first? Richard, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. As always, I learnt a lot from what you have to say, and I think that in some ways, because the most effective political violence tends to be the violence you don't have to use, you just threaten it, what you're describing fits very much within the remit of what centres like the Centre Tim Direct look at. Although you're rather humbly saying we haven't had enough research in it, given your experience and expertise and the fact that you're doing the job you're now doing in regard to this, do you have some initial intuitions about that which it would be appropriate at this stage for the UK government to think about doing?
Do you want to add a question to that, or are you happy to roll with that, Jonathan?
Let me just go for that.
Yep, fine.
Because I can't remember more than one thing at once. I I think it's a confluence of things. Like most things are, that's a truism, isn't it? But I mean, I suspect that the fact that social media affords you this opportunity is significant, but it runs alongside and of course, the other thing that social media enables you to do is to voice political opinions which actually might be entirely valid, but which are not usually sort of heard by elite media, if you want to put it in those ways. So, there is, in a sense, there is a good side and a bad side to that. But I do suspect that is part of it. But it comes at a point where I think, in general, the sort of liberal democratic model that we have taken as normative over the last 50, 60 years, 70 years perhaps, is under challenge, and we see that not only in sort of the UK, although but also in other parts of Europe and very clearly in Eastern Europe, etc. So I suspect there might be a wider sort of zeitgeist and political inflection point at the strategic level, allied to some real opportunity to do this much more easily, and that may be why two things have come together. So then it also goes to this question of, is politics about policy or is it about identity? And there's no question, I think, that we are moving closer to being it's an identity-based politics that we're seeing, identity being defined in quite a number of ways. And therefore, the othering of your opponents becomes almost sort of inherent in the nature of a political belief system which is based upon identity. So that's my intuition, but I don't know whether it's true.
And when the ex-head of MI5 starts using the postmodernist language of othering, the times have changed indeed. Lord Carlisle.
Question in two parts, if I may, Jonathan. You talked about political violence, quite rightly, as being a major issue. The question often arises as to whether this should be characterized as terrorism. Is it your view that giving, for example, animal rights activists, even extreme ones, the cachet of terrorism, may be a recruiting ground, and that it is better to deal with as many offences as possible as just criminal offences, rather than offences of terrorism? The second part to my question is, as the British people here know, the current government is trying to wind up the courts into passing much longer sentences for serious crime, including violence. Now, sentences on the whole are much shorter in the United Kingdom than in the United States, but they're much longer in the United Kingdom than in the European Union. Does the winding up of sentences in any way make it the life of MI5 or the police any easier?
Since that's a double-headed question, I'll let you take that, and we'll have Lord Campbell for the next one. But please answer that first, Jonathan, if you.
As a general kind of principle, I don't think one should apply the specific terrorist legislation unless you need to do so, because almost by definition, this is a set of legislation that tends to be more draconian and harder line than the normal criminal law, and therefore I think you should only use it when it is absolutely necessary to do so, because you should use minimum, kind of legal force, as it were. So where you can counter threats without invoking terrorism powers, then I think that is what you should do, because it's a proportionate response that one should be aiming for. So in that sense, I don't think we should immediately label it terrorism unless there's actually some advantage in doing so. We got very close to it, actually, with animal rights extremism at certain points. And, it seemed to me that at the point where they did start using a sort of explosive undercar booby trap, etc., this really is starting to be terrorism rather than law and order problem. But it was a one-off, really. But as a principle, you should only use the minimum force available, including legal force. On the question of longer sentences, I'm afraid I'm quite hawkish on this. It was you're kind of particularly. I mean, there are two reasons, neither of which, or only one of which, really is relating to my previous job. In MI5, and I believe this is almost certainly still the case, although I don't speak formally for MI5, there's always a lot more potential threat out there than you can necessarily focus on. Therefore, you are always in a very difficult prioritization game. And if somebody has got to the point where they have actually been convicted of a terrorist offence, then you can be pretty confident that they're quite high up the list of people that we worry about. Therefore, the longer they are out of commission, the more effective that is. I don't think there's a great deal of evidence that going to prison necessarily helps to reform people. Very often it does occasionally, but it's not a notable part of the British system that people come out of prison much better people than they went in. Quite often they come out much worse people than they went in. So you'd have to assume that anybody who has been in prison for a terrorism offence will probably be a big problem when they come out, and recent evidence suggests that's true. So just in straightforward sort of numerical terms, the longer somebody's in prison, the easier it is. So I'm quite happy with that. The other point, and this is a political sort of point really, or a small p political point, I think there's something corrosive about giving sentences which bear no relation to how long you are actually going to be in prison, because I think it undermines public confidence in the criminal justice system. And if somebody says, you are sentenced to 16 years, and then, 8 years later you're out walking the streets, I think people find that quite hard to understand and feel that the system is soft. And I think it's better just to say what you actually are going to do, rather than to give one sentence orally and then to have another completely different system which lets you out well before that point. So from my point of view, I would rather have a system which tried to bring those two closer into alignment, because I think it'd be easier for people to understand and it would be better in terms of confidence.
Thank you. If you could maybe have the microphone up the front for Lord Campbell, I think you're next. Just come in there, just behind you.
I was a member of Parliament for 28 years. I won my seat eventually at the third attempt. Were I in the similar position now, I'm by no means convinced that I would make the same kind of commitment, not least for many of the factors which you have just outlined so eloquently. And I marvel, genuinely marvel, at the robustness of women who put themselves forward for election to the House of Commons because of the catalogue that you have just described. I wonder, though, if some of this is due to the fact that the choices arising out of identity have become binary. You're either for independence, Scotland, or you're against it. As it happens, I'm against it. You're either for Britain being in the European Union or you're against it. And in those circumstances, people who might not be drawn into any argument because they neither have the capacity nor the willingness to be nuanced, find a ready expression of their political view. And it seems to me the background to this is a kind of nationalism. Nationalism in Scotland, of that there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever. I think you referred to it in passing. But certainly I regard Brexit as being a kind of nationalism as well. We want to make our own laws. We want to spend our own money. This is a kind of insularity which I think is part of nationalism. And I think that, therefore, the continuation of the kind of abuse that you've described is likely to be very evident, unless or until governments, or our government in particular, decides that the freedom which the internet service providers enjoy can no longer be allowed to do so because of the corruption it creates for the body politic.
I mean, I'm really an observation on what you say rather than any sense of response. I mean, I think you're right that binary decisions aren't good for the middle ground, because you have to have one or the other. One of the reasons that I think referenda are in a parliamentary system are a really bad idea, and I don't support referendums. I think conceptually they don't fit within a parliamentary system, and we shouldn't use them. Otherwise, what's the point of having MPs, personally? But I think I've been really struck by the courage of some of the people that I've spoken to. Jess Phillips, for instance, and she is absolutely, who won't be familiar to US colleagues, but she is the butt of a huge amount of abuse and threat, and she remains an outspoken and kind of feisty person, but she said, she got friends who said, I would not go into public life. And I think we are missing opportunity through that, and I think it really matters.
This gentleman at the back who's been waiting a good while.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Yeah. So my question is slightly from a more of a legal point of view. And it's in the context of the IPT a couple of months ago ruling MI5's policy of allowing informers to commit crimes while investigating terrorism offenses to be unlawful. That was more on the technical issues than on the merits of the whole policy. But my question sort of weaves that in with the couple of things you've seen have been asked before. So with the way the terrorist threat has been evolving, now we're seeing it move from a lot more mass mobilization to conversations in private spaces online and encrypted networks and things like that. So I was just very curious to hear your perspective on how you see the law evolving to account for this in terms of intelligence gathering and counterterrorism surveillance. I'd be interested to hear if you think that the current frameworks in place in terms of what is permitted and what's not, are they par for the course, or are there any specific reforms that you think are required to account for the way we're seeing the threat evolve and how you see it changing in the next 5 or 10 years maybe?
Yeah. We have, of course, had a lot of changes and developments in counterterrorism law over the last 20 years. When I came to the House of Lords in 2014, a colleague who was chatting to me said there's always a terrorism bill, of course, and there have been a lot of terrorism bills over the years, most of which have been fixing little sort of technical problems, really, rather than being wholesale changes, and I'm sure there will continue to be those. I think probably the overall legal framework is fairly well designed. I think the gap had been that the surveillance legislation, if you put it in those terms, the legal basis upon which surveillance is undertaken and controlled, got quite out of date because the rapidly moving changes in communications technology, etc., meant that the way in which you have to do that to be effective had gone a long way, and the law had not. And I suspect, therefore, that one of the areas there will need to be continuing updates in the legislation will be in the technology area, and you can already see that with the question of AI and so on, and what is the limits of public acceptability of AI. So I think there will be changes there. There is a bill coming before the House which is basically going to put the sentencing up, but that's really a tweak. It's not changing the sort of game. It's just sort of a little bit of change. I'm not aware, although I may not be in the best position to be aware, of a big area that just needs to be completely rethought. But we will need to keep updating the regulation around surveillance in order to keep up with rapidly changing technology. So I suspect that will come back. On the question of participation of human sources in criminality, as you say, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, when this question was put to them, came back with a judgment which was supportive of the current arrangements. The current arrangements are ungainly, shall we say, and they haven't really been explicitly legislated in recent times. The fundamental problem here is that it's quite evident that you cannot use human sources in a terrorism context unless they are going to commit offences, because if you are a member or supporter of a terrorist group, that is an offence if it's a proscribed group. So just by being there, you are risking an allegation that you are committing a crime. You said allowing. I think it would be fair to say, and I'm not close to this today. I don't think there's anything in the arrangements, and as I'm reading the media reporting and the court reporting on this, that suggests that anybody is given any immunity. And I don't think that, as far as I'm aware, the intelligence agencies have an ability to give immunity. But obviously, prosecutorial decisions are a matter for the prosecution rules, and those include public interest issues. So there's a public interest question as to whether prosecuting somebody who was actually active at a meeting because they were working for the British government would be in the public interest to prosecute them for terrorist offences. So I guess that's what you would have to rely on. But the issue there is, it may be that at some point it will be necessary to legislate, but at the moment we've had recent confirmation that the legal arrangements are acceptable. So that's an encouragement. But all these issues are taken extremely seriously. And, one of the most notable changes, certainly in MI5 during the time from the point that I joined. When I joined MI5, there was one lawyer, and he also took in washing, as it were, from MI6 to keep himself occupied, and he did all the public affairs stuff. So there wasn't a lot of lawyering going on. When I left, I think there were 35 full-time lawyers, so that's a 70-fold increase in lawyers. There's probably gone up again a long way since then. So, if any of you who are lawyers, this is good times, and there are lots and lots of jobs to be done. So, law has increasingly become a very big part of intelligence, particularly in domestic intelligence work, and that's kind of probably the way it should be.
Thank you. I'm very aware I've had a very male-dominated discussion. Can we do anything about that? Yes, in the front row.
Thank you for your very thought-provoking talk. And just to go back with a question on that, you've referenced some of the threats that the security service and police are dealing with in international terrorism and hostile state threats and the levels of crime. When you talk about the issues with public intimidation of public figures, do you have any thoughts on where the resource would come from to investigate and research and tackle that as an issue?
Well, I think we've already seen some progress on this, because certainly it's my view that the police were quite slow to recognise the significance of this issue. And it's a significant issue largely because of its political impact. It's obviously, at a human level, you don't want to be subject to intimidation, whether you're an MP or whether it's, somebody who, is acting in that way for completely different reasons. But the social impact of intimidating political figures is very considerable. But I think the police took a bit of time to catch up with that, and their response was patchy. I think it's much improved. So there is a much more consistent model of support and security for MPs as they go about their duties, both in their constituencies and elsewhere. So in that sense, the police response, the protective response has improved, and the Houses of Parliament authorities, again, in my view, were very slow out of the blocks on this, but they've been trying hard to catch up, and ditto with the Home Office, who originally, I'm speaking frankly, as far as I could see, didn't want to have to get anything involved with this at all, and thought it wasn't their problem. And it's taken quite a lot of effort to get the Home Office to step up and do things, but they are now doing that. So the government and security system has started to respond to this, and indeed the Director of Public Prosecutions has issued guidance to all MPs on what might or might not constitute a criminal offence in respect of abuse and intimidation, as opposed to just nasty stuff. So there is response, but we're still not seeing a significant improvement. It's not the problem with it is that it's not the sort of thing which as it were intelligence investigation is going to help, because this is mostly some of it is organised for political reasons. Quite a lot of it is just disagreeable people doing disagreeable things, but nevertheless the effect of it is actually quite significant in political terms, in my view. So it needs to be addressed, which is part of the reason I said the responders to this will be a different group from those who respond to traditional terrorism conspiracies, which are susceptible, or certainly in the past were more susceptible to detailed investigation. So there needs to be some real serious policy thought about what can be done to improve the situation. A good place to start, of course, is the report by my committee in 2017, which made a whole series of recommendations on this to the social media companies, to government, to the police, etc., etc. So there are potential ways forward, but they need to be grasped and really pushed in order to make sense of it. And at the moment, the level of real granular understanding of what's going on is a bit fragmented, I'd say.
I think in a moment I shall have to indulge my inner dictator to guillotine this discussion on the health of democracy. If we maybe just squeeze in one last question from the gentleman in the third row who's been waiting patiently, and then we will have to wrap it up.
Thank you, Lord. Jeff Fiorito from the University of St. Andrews, CSTPV. You mentioned our Second Amendment here in the U.S., and my question, I think, is more related to the First Amendment. Can you talk a little bit about hate speech laws and their effectiveness? I won't ask you to comment on the constitutionality debate, but maybe their effectiveness in the U.K., and there are more and more calls here in the U.S. for hate speech laws, possibly to be modeled after the U.K., so I wonder if you could comment on that.
I'm not terribly well equipped to answer that question. You have tomorrow two very distinguished lawyers in Lord Campbell and Lord Carlisle, who you can put the question to them as well. But I mean, we do have hate speech laws. There's still an awful lot of hate speech, and the difficulty is that some of the definitional issues become complex. So, some of the tabloids like to run most weeks a story of, some, street preacher who, is being hauled off by the police for hate speech because they said something about, you're going to go to hell if you don't believe or something, which most people probably don't think is hate speech. So it's quite tricky as to get the judgments right on this. And I mean, like most of these things, they kind of tend to come out in the system all right, and over-enthusiastic policing, and then they don't actually get prosecuted and so on. But it's slightly contentious, and it is a delicate one between what is free speech and what is actually genuinely threatening to people. So we do have those laws. They are still contentious, and they're not fully successful. But I don't think I can go much further than that.
As you say, to be continued tomorrow with our eminent lawyers. I'm going to hand over in a moment to the next panel, which Dan Byman is going to serve us up a oven tray of hot political potatoes labelled Iran and Hezbollah. Before we do that, though, I'd like to thank Lord Evans for a highly provocative and I think some ways disturbing set of remarks that certainly address a phenomenon that goes well beyond what he, with British understatement, described as disagreeable people doing disagreeable things. I know you said it was more than that, but that's the phrase that lingers in the memory. But I think there is an emerging, I won't just say a research agenda for the sake of intellectual curiosity, but I mean a pressing moral and policy issue there, and I thank you for using your time to highlight it. If we could just thank Lord Evans, I'd be appreciative. Thank you.